George's willingness to follow up on the discussion that we ended the faculty seminar with. There were so many people involved that we really didn't have much chance for discussion, and the session that we're supposed to have over there kind of got squeezed out. So they have a lot of information to share, and he has brought with him Ben Jones and Tiffany Skinner, and they're going to tell you what they do. So George, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Dr. Dirksen. And like she said, my name is George Bostanic. I'm the Director for Residential Life and Housing. And thank you for allowing us to continue this very important discussion, because it is something that we're seeing rapidly grow on our campuses. And so what we're going to do today is I am going to highlight a little bit of the presentation that we talked about in January. How many of you were able to make that presentation in January? Okay, so about half of you. So I'll highlight, I got to present with Dr. Mike Hayes and Dr. David Quagliana, and I'll highlight a little bit of their presentation, and then Tiff and Ben are here to explain a little bit of what our procedures look like on campus, and explain a little bit more about that, and then we'll have a time for questions. So at this time, I'll let them introduce themselves.
Yeah, so my name's Ben Jones. I've been at Lee since 2006 as a student, and in Res Life since 2011. My title is Area Coordinator, which I supervise a subset of the RDs. So there's 3 of us that each supervise 4 resident directors and their residence hall partnerships. So we work with them a lot to sort of develop a response to students in crisis and make sure a standard of care is being met. So.
And I'm Tiffany Skinner. I'm a resident director here at Lee. I have been at Lee since 2009 as a student, was in residential life as an undergrad student, and I've been a professional staff member since 2013. I'm over at Sharp Davis Hall, so you see us there on the corner next to the Con Center and PCSU. So you might be wondering what a resident director does. We do a lot of different things. Everything from mentorship of our student staff. We have a staff member, an RA that lives on each hall, and a resident chaplain in each building. So we get to work with them, mentor them, and then we also work with students in distress, so responding and care for students that are struggling. And we also help put on events, at both educational, social. Those are some highlights, but we do a lot of other things as well. So yeah, thanks for letting us come and talk to you guys today.
Yeah, so as we jump into the presentation, please write down any notes or questions that you have, because at the end we do want to have a conversation and discussion about this. So to start off our conversation, Dr. Hayes talked about this book, College of the Overwhelmed. And this book was actually published in 2004, and the authors talked about this mental health crisis that is coming to our campuses. And boy, were they ever right about that. And you'll see in some of the statistics from even our counseling center how much this has been on the rise in the past 10 years. So this was written almost 15 years ago, so you can imagine how much this has intensified. And so I'll pass this around because I think there are some important chapters in here if any of you wanted to do more reading on mental health crisis, suicidality. It also talks about if you have a student in college, how you can coach your student to get the resources and the help they need, know what signs to look for. So I can just pass this around. You guys can take a look as I continue to talk. So from this discussion of College of the Overwhelmed, we basically boiled it down to this sentence. This is a book about the extraordinary increase in serious mental illness on college campuses today and what we can do about it. If your son or daughter is in college, the chances are almost 1 in 2 that he or she will become depressed to the point of being unable to function. 1 in 2 that he or she will have regular episodes of binge drinking. We never have drinking here at least, so that doesn't apply to us. And 1 in 10 that he or she will seriously consider suicide. And as we get into more of the data, you'll see that this has risen drastically. So from this conversation and talking about this book, we talked about a series that's out called 13 Reasons Why. Have any of you been able to see this series on Netflix? So it's definitely in the fall something that our students were watching a lot of, and unfortunately it's a little bit of a spoiler, but the premise of this series is this young girl in high school, she commits suicide, but before she does that, she writes these talks about these 13 tapes and 13 people in her life that basically failed her and didn't care enough about her, and these are the reasons why she's committing suicide. And one of the focal points in the series, one of the statements that she makes, I think I've made myself very clear, but no one's stepping forward to stop me. A lot of you cared, just not enough. And that is what I needed to find out. And so there's a lot of controversy on this series because from Jay Asher's original novel, they switched up and made it a little bit more graphic in the series. So the way that she committed suicide, they made it more graphic. But it really raised a lot of questions in higher institutions because students were starting to see this as a reality of something that they could possibly do. Started to blur the lines a little bit. There's a lot of articles that talk about this. And so we actually had an event in the fall semester that addressed some of these issues that they talk about in the series. So it's something to keep in mind as we continue this conversation. So from there, we talked about how does this relate to Lee? I think a common misconception is that a lot of institutions think when serious things happen on campuses that it can never happen to them. Here at Lee, we are not immune. So as you can see from data from the Counseling Center, and I'll focus on the seriously considered suicide, from 2008 and 2009 to 2017, almost 10 years, we had 20% raise of students, so 52.4% who, when they come into the Counseling Center, they say they have seriously considered suicide. Which, talking with David and his staff, it's just astounding to see that number. And if you were to rank that amongst other higher institutions, it's pretty average. It's not only happening here at Lee, it's happening among other higher institutions. And so from that, we talked about 1 student per week in the fall semester was admitted to the hospital for psychiatric care this semester. So after we have done an assessment with a student, we deem them that they weren't safe enough to be by themselves or were a threat to others. And a lot of students will tell you that straight up. They'll say, if you leave me here, I'm afraid of what will happen. And so, yeah, it breaks our hearts to see some of these things, but this is what we're dealing with on a weekly basis, and why I appreciate the work that Ben and Tiff do living in the halls, because a lot of these things happen in the evening time or late at night where we have to respond and make a decision of what do we do with this student. So more data from the Counseling Center. As you can see here, there's an increased service of demand, and it only goes back to 2014, but every year it continues to rise. And the book will share that as well, of every year this is a crisis we have on our hands. And so not only is there an increased service of demand, there's an increased sessions per client. So no longer can they come in and say, we're going to only keep you for 3 sessions and then you should be good to go. It's more like 5, 6, 7, and even past that. And so we're trying to figure out, how do we give the support to our students that they need when we have this many staff members and this many clients, and it's continuing to rise. And so one of the things we all pointed out in our presentation is that every interaction matters, and that's why we wanted to talk to you as faculty, because you get to have those interactions in the classroom, and we're having them in the residence halls. And so we need to figure out a way that we can collaborate and have a wraparound care for our students and support them the best way possible. And then lastly, from the Counseling Center, they broke it down a little bit more of what this elevated distress looked like. So whether that's depression, anxiety, academic distress, alcohol use, again, here at Lee, we are not immune, and these things are very real. And so we need to start thinking and being proactive how we can address these concerns. And yeah, it's not all on the Counseling Center to help these students. It's all of our jobs as staff and faculty to help our students. So what does this look like for our students that live on campus? So in fall 2017, we had 25 students who reported thoughts of having suicidal ideation. And out of those 25, we had responses and interventions involving 33 students with suicidal ideation. So for some of these students, It's not just happening one time, it's a constant thing that they're struggling with. And that's why we're thinking too, whenever they go into a facility to get the help that they need, we need to have an action plan when they get back, because it's just not going to magically go away. So we need to continue to have follow-up and looking at these students of how we can support them in the best way possible. So with that being said, I'm going to have Tiff talk a little bit about what it looks like whenever we hear that a student is suicidal, or we get a notification from a faculty member, or a student goes to an RA, and she'll talk through the process of what that looks like.
Okay, so as George mentioned, obviously if someone's expressing some thoughts of suicide, we'd have to take that very seriously. Because this is on a continuum. They could be maybe questioning, maybe thinking about it for the first time, like, suicide could be an option for me. Or at that very moment, they might have the plan, they might have the means, and so we have to follow up immediately. So if we receive a notification, we're going to have immediate follow-up. A lot of the times, for me, that's going to come through one of my RAs, like I was saying, my staff members. They'll be talking to a student, or they'll hear about something. Although you never know. A few years ago, I was sitting in my office, just on my computer, answering some emails, and a student walked right in and said, "I am going to kill myself." It's like, all right, we're going to deal with that. So if we receive a notification, I'm going to go to that student. We will always have a professional staff member kind of follow up with that student. So even if our student staff has been there, talked to them, we're always going to do an assessment ourselves. So I'll go in and we do a suicide assessment, which takes them through asking them, have you had thoughts of killing yourself? You've got to be very direct. If that's a yes, okay. Do you have means? Do you have a plan to follow this out? Yes, I have a plan. Do you have means? And then do you have intent? So we kind of gauge them on that scale. Where are they at? Is it thoughts of suicide, or are you about to commit suicide and this is serious? It's all serious, but this is immediate, a need. So we have on-call RDs 24/7, 365. So there's always someone from our department that's on call. We're on call during the week, so Nathan's an RD as well. We're all on call for our building. So throughout the week we're on call. On the weekend we have a rotation. So during the weekend there's 2 RDs on call. One of those has what we call an RD pager. So if at any time one of our student staff members can't get a hold of us, they have a number they can call to get a hold of that RD pager. So on the weekends, it can get a little bit busy for us, especially if you're that on-call RD with that pager, because you are receiving lots of calls from across campus. We thankfully have support as well. So if I get a call to go check in on a student, it's not just me flying solo figuring this out. Ben is actually my area coordinator, so if something were to happen, we're immediately getting other people involved in that as well and getting feedback. So if I'm talking to a student, they're expressing to me that they're suicidal, I am going to call Ben, or whichever area coordinator is on call if it's after hours, and getting some backup opinions and backup support. A lot of the times it's straightforward. If you've done it a while, you kind of know, okay, I'm pretty sure this is what's about to happen, but getting input. If it gets a little more complicated, Ben also has backup. He might be calling George or Mandy Stockton. It can go all the way up to Mike Hayes, who's our vice president. We're getting lots of people collaborating in on that. So I'm going to jump down to possible responses there. If the student is maybe expressing some thoughts of suicide, we could fill out a safety plan with them, and that's them committing, saying, hey, I'm going to stay safe for whatever they feel like they could commit to me. Maybe that is 2 hours. Maybe that's this week. I feel safe to commit. And we'll help walk them through some numbers, some people they can call, some resources. But a lot of times it's calling 911. It's getting them in an ambulance, and it's getting them to some help right there immediately. We also have CRT, or crisis response, and they're a free service. They can come out and do an assessment with that student as well and talk them through some of the options. A lot of times that also results in inpatient, and we're taking them to that's kind of where we land on that and get them back. And then when they do come back, so a lot of times our students will go for maybe 3 days a week or something. They've had some more intensive counseling. We will be obviously following up continually with that student, making sure that they are adjusting back, and do they need anything? How are they doing? How are they feeling? And then, yes, back up to assessment training. We obviously have professional staff members, which are who we are, and we have intensive July training with the resident directors, so we're talking them through how to do a lot of these things. We also have professional development every other Friday. We're actually getting Brittany Gates from the Counseling Center coming to talk to us tomorrow about working with students following up. We've done some QPR training, question, persuade, refer. I'm sure I'm missing some other professional training that we do. Obviously, we have consultation. If we have some students, I might be coming by George's office or Ben's office and sitting down and we're working out a plan. Our RAs and RCs also receive training in this. We have a pretty intensive week in August. They're usually the first students back. And we do training with them on students in crisis. A lot of time, and they're always told to make sure to get a professional staff member involved. But they're also given training on signs to look out for, things to spot, and kind of how to approach those conversations. Yeah.
Thanks, Tiff. And yeah, I think that training piece is so important because a lot of our resident directors, I would say more than half of our staff this year, are straight out of college. And so they're learning, this is their first professional job. And so to have very pointed and good training of what to do, how do you assess a student who's in need, it's so important. But they do such a great job in doing that. Of course, they love their students, but doing that in a loving and tactful way that they can support their students well. So we talked about collaboration and how we want to collaborate with all of you. Ben's going to talk a little bit about some of the offices that we collaborate with across campus.
Yeah, so taking care of our students is definitely a collaborative effort, and so everyone you see on the screen here plays a role in that in terms of partnering with us and us partnering with them. Counseling Center is normally going to be our sort of first stop for a student in crisis to make that referral. And from there, the Counseling Center will try to connect them to either individual sessions or group sessions, or if they're full up, we'll make a referral out to the community. And so they're a great resource for us. And one of the things that really helps, when an RD is working with a student, we can request or ask that student, hey, we're all trying to support you. Would you be willing for the Counseling Center to talk to us? And if we're able to get that disclosure, then we're able to communicate a lot more directly. So if something happens in a session that a counselor feels, okay, the RD should really be aware of this, and the residents, they're able to pass that on to us, which is super helpful when it happens. The Student Care Committee is another place that's sort of our bread and butter for talking through the best ways to support students. This is a group that meets every Friday that carries a caseload of anywhere from 30 to 50 students that have had some kind of presented need on campus. So the majority of those are needs that have surfaced through some extent in the residence hall. And so these Friday meetings that include a number of campus parties will often end with information that we take and then distribute back to our resident directors and say, okay, in your conversations this coming week, can you be following up on the students with these things? And the RDs do a great job of reaching out to students and talking to them without it making it feel like there's this big brother that's watching them sort of thing. So it's more supportive than that. So just to give you a sense of who sits on that, there's 2 representatives from Res Life. So both of the assistant directors, Morgan, my wife, and Mandy Stockton are part of that group. Stacy York is there, sort of an administrative assistant. Mike Hayes sits in on that as well to provide direction. Kristen Pope is there and is able to speak from sort of the LEAP perspective. Aaron Looney is there to talk through some of what's happening over in the hub. Mickey Moore comes as a representative from the health clinic. Dr. Bradford is normally there from academic support. So it's a lot of people around the table. And I think I missed someone. Kirsty Williams is there from the MFT Center here, and then also Brittany Gates sits in from the Counseling Center. So pretty much any of these offices, I would say, except for campus security, has someone there present in those meetings to offer their feedback. And that's super helpful because there might be times when an RD is asked to follow up on a certain student, and we might say, okay, nothing happened in the residence hall with John, but Mickey Moore might say, oh, actually, we saw John this week, and you should be intentional with. Everyone in that room is sort of governed by their own, like, okay, what can I talk about, what can I offer here? But it is a place for good collaborative conversation. Campus security is another great resource for us. So anytime you see ambulance, emergency response on campus, they're there with us for that. They help us do room searches a lot if we feel like a student might be a threat to themselves and have the means to execute that, or a threat to someone else. And occasionally, if we have a student that needs to follow up with a medical need or inpatient, they're able to provide some basic transportation to keep that student from having to pay, $1,500 to ride an ambulance from here to to Ocoee Street. So that's super helpful. Work with the hub a lot. We refer there anytime we feel like, and that's been a great resource that's new this year for us. Because basically anytime in the past someone's needed to study or like help with study habits or just balancing life, we've had to either send them to academic support or give the RD resources to coach them through how to study. So now that we have somewhere we can refer and say, okay, these sort of things you're dealing with, they can really help with, has been wonderful. And Kelsey Baker, who oversees the coaches there, is a former area coordinator and resident director as well. So she's been great in terms of working collaboratively with us in that. The health clinic obviously is our referral anytime a student might have a medical need going on. Even if they've been hospitalized and received care, we'll often refer them back to the health clinic once they're back on campus so that they can receive some free follow-up appointments rather than having to go back and forth. Dr. Hayes, again, he's sort of the top person in the student care chain that is able to provide feedback and sort of structure the way that we do things. And then faculty and staff have played a critical role in the past, in my experience. So there's often, I can think of several examples of, faculty reaching out and saying, hey, I'm worried about this student. Could you check on them? It comes from staff members as well. And that's wonderful when it happens for us, especially since it reflects that, student care is sort of the business of all of us, not just the people on the screen. So, yeah, so these are the sort of the main sources that we collaborate with, all designed to prepare good care for students.
And again, I think that's just important to point out because even with my staff, I say you don't have to have all the answers, but you do need to know where the resources are and how to get students to those resources. And I think that's all of our jobs of knowing, okay, these are the resources we have on campus, let's utilize them to the fullest potential. And so now that we went through, that's kind of the session that we planned earlier in January if you weren't there. I have some pointed questions for Ben and Tiff that I would love for them to answer, and this is more of a practical application for all of you. And then after that, we'll open up the time for you to ask any questions. So what are maybe some tips or signs that a student may be suicidal?
Yeah, this can take a variety of different cues and indicators, ranging from a physical change you might notice to a behavioral change to just the things a student is saying. So thinking through some of what we most often see in the residence hall, anytime there's like a major change to a person's sleeping pattern, so they're staying up all hours of the night, there might be some signs of insomnia that's coming from a place of unrest. That's a good indicator for us if a student's patterns are off. And loss of interest in personal hygiene or appearance is another one that we have the pleasure of talking with students about, which is always a fun conversation to tell someone you smell more than you think you do. But that can be an indicator that, okay, they've stopped caring about their basic well-being, keeping up with this. Is there something more going on? It sounds simple, but talking about suicide or death, so there's jokes that someone who maybe hasn't, someone on the floor might think, oh, so-and-so is kidding around, but one of our RAs has been trained to hear that and know they have to follow up. And sometimes that's an RA saying, hey, we need to have a conversation about the meaning of words and what I hear when you say this. But sometimes it also leads to finding out, okay, no, I'm joking about this because I have been sort of contemplating these things. And that takes a number of forms. Like Tiffany mentioned, sometimes a student might come in and say, hey, I'm thinking about killing myself. And that's great. We have a lot to work with there. Other times it might be more like, I'm just kind of over this. I wish this had ended. I don't want to be here anymore. Very vague statements that we teach our RAs and other staff to follow up on. Alcohol and drug use is another big. So any of those sort of coping mechanisms, I think Lena refers to them as STIRBs, so they're short-term energy release behaviors. Any of that stuff can point towards something more substantial going on. Withdrawing from friends and family, so if you had a student who's sort of engaged on the hall and then you realize I haven't seen them in 2 weeks, they're not going to class, they're in bed at 2 p.m, like, okay, what's going on here? And so that kind of withdrawal or quitting activities that used to be important. So maybe they were in choir and they dropped out of the choir, they have sort of suspended their involvement in a Greek club. Any of that, like retreating into themselves, is a good indicator for us. One of the biggest predictors, maybe the biggest, is if there's been any kind of previous history of a suicide attempt, and that will often come out in small group conversations. where students might open up about their past and things they've struggled with. So that's something that we immediately sort of catalog away and realize, okay, if you've been able to get there mentally before, it's easier to get there again. And so we try to pay attention to those sort of behaviors. And then anyone that's just expressing a feeling of hopelessness or disconnection or worthlessness or making comments about that you could view as low self-esteem, taken in isolation, but looking at the larger picture, you start to see, okay, this student's really, really struggling.
Yeah, I mean, as faculty, the only other thing I could think of is if a student just stops coming to class, and we all know that there are multiple reasons for that. They could just be over it and don't want to be here because their mom's making them come to Lee. But if you let us know that a student has just not been coming, I can at least then go follow up with that student and talk to them. And it might just be like, all right, we need to like work on getting to class, but I could find out that they are really just, they're depressed and they're sleeping all the time and they can't kind of get it together. So that's something, it's an indicator of something, whether that's they're suicidal or they're depressed, it is an indicator. So yeah, definitely let us know if you see that.
So how do you approach this conversation? As you mentioned, it's not something, when a student comes and says, I'm thinking about killing myself, that's one that opens the door, but how does that, what are some tips of how to approach that conversation?
Yeah, it's hard and it's awkward. It's also, it feels very foreign as well, because it's something I mentioned, you have to be pretty direct. If you're concerned that a student might be suicidal, it's not the time to mince words, you know, and try to tactfully dance around it. There's a myth that if you bring it up and you say it, you're going to put it in their head and then they're going to be like, oh, wow, I didn't think of that. That's a great plan. You're not. If you mention it and you ask them, you're not going to they are not more likely to commit suicide because of that. So don't worry about that. To approach this conversation, I think just start out with showing some genuine care. And we are at Lee University. You guys are here because you care about students. You made time to come to a session about students in distress. But students have like a radar for that. They know if we are just asking because we're concerned about liability, or they are just like, whatever, you're just asking because you have to. And sometimes that will be the response, but if you can communicate consistent care, and sit them down and just be like, hey, like, I've noticed, like, I'm worried about you, and just kind of start out with that, extending genuine care to them, it makes it easier to then be like, I'm gonna ask you an awkward question. Like, have you thought about killing yourself? Thought about taking your life? They might immediately, no, not at all. Not at all. And you can kind of get a gauge of like, okay, doesn't sound like you really have been. But you can kind of start that conversation, kind of to take the leap and go there. But I think my biggest tip would be show care. Take the time to just ask to sit down for just a second and chat, and don't be afraid to kind of go there.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add in terms of not mincing words, asking someone if they want to harm themselves or kill themselves are different questions. So a person could say, no, I don't want to harm myself, and not be lying to you, but still be contemplating suicide. And so as like painful as it feels to say those words, that is sort of the way we are trained to approach it. And then in that same vein, it's also easy to ask the question. So I might ask you, are you having thoughts of suicide? Or I might ask you, you're not having thoughts of suicide, are you? And so that's not the same question, right? Because you've already sort of tipped your hand. I hope you tell me that you're not, because I don't want to go down this road. And so it's more comfortable for you, but it's also more permissive for the person that's hearing it. So I think, direct language phrased in an open-ended way that conveys that you're open to whatever they're going to share with you.
So since you both have been here for a few years, maybe in the past semester or the past year, give an example of what it's looked like to work with a faculty member with a student that maybe you needed to check up on, or a student in distress.
Yeah, I can think of an example this past semester where Dr. Quagliana put a student on our radar who we already had some interaction with, and normally that's the case. I mean, it's stuff that we've noticed, but it was immensely helpful to know, this is another set of eyes that's sort of paying attention to the student and cares enough about the student to be reaching out. Because when he reached out to us about her concern, we then sent our staff to check in. But this was after he had already had conversations with the student, and out of that emerged a sense of concern. And so anytime something happens in the classroom and a faculty member is able to put that on our plate, it's incredibly helpful context for us because faculty relationships are incredibly impactful. But on average, you're seeing a student 3 hours a week, and so when they're with you, if they're safe, that doesn't necessarily say a lot for the other hours that they're at home. And so it's just it's so helpful for us to know those things so that we can keep an eye on the students and offer that support.
Yeah. I've had multiple tips this year. Hey, this student hasn't been coming to class. Can you go check in? And that's been, this year, thankfully, that's been mostly just like, okay, we maybe need to work on our priorities, we maybe need to work on our time management, and not been anything really mental health related, which is great. But yeah, I've definitely had tips in the past. Can you check on this student? They've not been coming to class, or just they didn't seem right. They just didn't seem right. They weren't their normal self, and checked in. And there's definitely been more there, and wouldn't have known unless someone had said and put it on the radar, like, hey, they didn't seem right in class today. And I know we've got that new software that we're using, which has been cool, to be able to flag students, but definitely don't hesitate because, we're there, so we can go find them, check up. We've got RAs as well. I can ask my RAs, like, hey, have you noticed anything with this student? Do they seem normal? Do they seem okay? So we definitely have some resources there.
Yeah, we wanna be a catalyst for all of you to help in their education. We know they're coming here to get a degree, and only part of that is outside of the classroom in the residence hall. So we want to do anything possible to help their learning and what's going on inside the classroom and translate that to what they're doing outside the classroom. So some resources that I want to share with all of you. If you sense anything is off or that a student's struggling, you're not sure, typically an RA or an RD, because they do see them usually on a daily basis and are living with them, they will see something extra that if you give us a tip of, hey, this student's really struggling, would you mind just checking in? We love getting those emails because it helps us know, like, there's something additional going on. It's usually just the tip of the iceberg of, this is what it's showing, but underneath, they're going through a lot of different things that we need to address and get them help with. So please feel free to shoot me an email, give me a call. We always are more than willing to partner with you in checking in on a student. If you're concerned about a student expressing suicidal ideation, you can contact Mike Hayes immediately. There's his office phone. If it's after hours, campus security is always the number one go-to. And then if there's a suicidal attempt, we don't mess around. We call 911 right away. And then we contact the proper authorities, Mike Hayes or campus security, and go from there. So again, I'm so grateful that we can continue this conversation and continue to see how we can support our students well. And I thank you guys for taking the time to come out and to continue this conversation. So with that being said, are there any questions from any of you that you have, any concerns, thoughts that you would like to express?
Have there been any suicides? So you've got all the data in terms of students seeking help. How many suicides has Lee experienced in the past 4 or 5 years since the curve really took a steep incline?
We've been very fortunate that no one has completed, I guess is the term. But we have had, anecdotally, I would say an attempt a year, maybe, in my time here. So, and that's ranged from something we have found out about after the fact to something that we have been very involved in and been very public. So, fortunately, no students have lost their lives. But.
And one thing that we are grateful for is typically when students are experiencing this, in some form or fashion, they will reach out. It's not always direct, but they'll tell their roommate or they'll talk to their RA or their RD. And from there, we act fast. But that's a good question.
Go ahead.
Thank you. What is there a percentage of students? I know we talked about students being in distress and causing harm to themselves. Is there any data on students who are in distress and possibly causing harm to others?
We don't have data on that, but that's one of the questions we typically, like, are they at harm to themselves and are they at harm to others? So if the answer is yes to any of those questions, we get them help immediately. And I don't even know if David's office tracks that. I don't know if you guys,
I don't think so.
but every session that we've been in with them, I haven't heard them track any data of like at harm to others, but that's definitely something we take into consideration as we're doing an assessment. Got two
Go ahead.
questions.
No, go ahead.
Well, I've had it numerous times. I've had a similar scenario kind of play out where a student disappears and doesn't come to class for a couple of weeks, and they might come back like once and then be gone for another couple of weeks or something. But then eventually they come to my office, or they send me an email asking if they can come to my office, and they come to my office and say, I haven't been in class and I'm really sorry, and I'm upset about what's happening with my semester, but I have severe depression, or I've been diagnosed as bipolar, or a number of different things in that vein. At that point, like my response to them is, are you getting help from someone already? Have you talked to the counseling center? And almost every case they have already, in some cases they've said to me, well, I tried, but I can't get an appointment until, sometime in the future. So I assume they've assessed them and, are not concerned that they're in immediate danger or something like that. But last semester was the first time that I actually used the program that the hub, kind of initiated, and, sent a note about a student that I was concerned about. But I'm just wondering, is there something else I should be saying or doing? Or, I'm just trying to listen to them and, talk to them about what's going on with their life. But I'm not a, professional in this, and so I feel like it's better for me not to pretend that I am, but to make sure that they're at least contacting somebody.
Well, I'll start off, and then if you guys have any. I would say the earlier you can notify somebody that they're not coming, so if it's the second class and they only have 2 classes a week, I would probably notify somebody that this student's not coming to class, or it's just odd behavior that they haven't been there. And if they try to go to the counseling center, I would always use their RD as well, and this would only happen with students that live on campus, but have you talked to your RD about this? Because sometimes we don't even know, and it becomes tricky when they go to the counseling center but don't come to us as well because confidentiality. And so a lot of times, sometimes they can go and get the counseling center's full at the time, or they do try and for whatever reason they can't take them in at that time, and we don't even know about it. And so that's where like the collaboration piece, as much wraparound care we can have, we need that, because sometimes we're left in the dark too of like, why didn't you tell us about this sooner? We can direct you to the right resource. Some of them are scared to do it. Some of them just don't know, like, where do I go? And the first thought is, I need to go to the counseling center. Anything you guys would add to that?
No, I think that's a good tip. And I think sometimes I think this is confusing for students as well, because it almost feels like they're doing something wrong. And so as the RD, part of my job is also enforcing residence hall policies. So sometimes coming to talk to me can feel like going to the principal's office. So if you can send them my way, like that is my least favorite part of my job. I love to just hang out with students and get to know them, grab coffee, and make them feel heard. So yeah, pushing them our way is great. And I know, like, just to highlight what George was talking about, last year I had a student who just disappeared, didn't know where she was, and we were very concerned. The RA was like, I haven't seen her, I don't know where she is. we're like going all around campus and driving places and talking to her friends. Her friends are freaking out. Her family's freaking out. Turns out she was inpatient. She had checked herself in to somewhere to get some help. And no one, she had been going to the counseling center, but confidentiality, so they couldn't tell us. So we're left, genuinely thinking this student may have gone and committed suicide. We don't know. She's off the map. So definitely, that's nothing that, it's nobody's fault. We just didn't know that she was struggling until that happened.
And just giving an open door to a student. So if they didn't come to class that week, like sending an email like, hey, I didn't see you in class this week. Is everything okay? Usually just giving that question gives them an open door to have that discussion. A lot of times we do see it like 2 or 3 weeks later, we find out they haven't been going to classes, and then it's like, how do we get you back on track? And so we're connecting with other resources to, okay, let's go talk to your professors, try to get you back on track. So we try to encourage the students as much as possible, like whenever they need the help, get it as soon as possible.
Can we just follow up on the confidentiality? See, that's where we're kind of caught in the classroom, because if a student comes in, you say,
Yeah.
Have you been to the health clinic or have you been sick because you had the flu? I said, yeah, I've had the flu, terrible flu, and so here's my doctor's excuse. They come in, and they haven't been there for a while, and you're trying to hold the standard for the class as you are in the dorm, except nobody's telling you anything.
Yeah.
So you don't know whether to give them a pass or not, or how to help them, because nobody's talking to you about it. And so you don't want to, how do you know that you're not kind of pushing them into doing
Right.
something? So you get this, that's kind of where I come down, is that you're saying, if this person needs my assistance, or I should be asking him, or if I'm pushing him kind of further into whatever their depression
Right.
or their,
Yeah,
they're
and-
here academically, and so it's very easy.
Mm-hmm.
Then at what point do you decide they should need to go home?
That's typically up to Mike whenever we will do everything possible, because we do have resources on campus to keep them here if they want to be here. A lot of students, whenever they're going through this, they're afraid if they admit that they're having suicidal thoughts that they're going to be kicked out of the college, which is not, that's far from the truth. And I've seen Mike work through a lot of different cases where students, time after time again, they're dealing with these thoughts and having these ideas. And so we're collaborating as much as possible. And an additional part to what you just talked about, one thing we just talked about with our staff is doing a release of information between us and the counseling center so that we can support our students better. Of if we know a student's going to the counseling center for this specific need, and we've been having this conversation with the student, before it's been like, oh, we can't tell you anything, and we can neither confirm nor deny this happened. And so now we have release forms that, whether the counseling center does it or our staff fills it out with a student, where they fill that out and then we can discuss like the topics that they put on that page of, these are the areas that I'm really struggling in. I give you release of information to talk about these certain areas. And we're hoping that's going to be a helpful piece. And again, we're having Brittany Gates from the Counseling Center come tomorrow because, yeah, legally we have to think about, there's a lot of confidentiality, but yet we want to support our students the best way that we can. And so that's definitely a barrier we continually have to navigate.
Students consistently tell me that they can't get into the counseling center, that there's a big student backlog. And is there any way that we can collaboratively push for additional help? Do they not have enough room? Or, it seems like if you look at these statistics, and they're handling so many more cases over such a much longer period of time, and they're so much more severe, is there a way that we can say, yes, staff up? Yeah.
And we definitely have been recommending that and pushing for that. And if you look at a lot of other institutions, a lot of our peer institutions, they'll have services that last throughout the night that RDs can call. So it's not the Res Life staff making the assessments of, is this student safe? It's a professional making the assessment of, is this student safe? And so those are some of the barriers we're confronting here at Lee. We are short-staffed and the cases are going up, and it continues to trend that way. So I know that Mike has been very much in that corner of fighting for more positions in the counseling center, and we definitely need that. So
Yeah.
I
Anyone?
have more.
okay.
Oh yeah, I was just about to say, if anyone has an in to get that, let's do it. I just had a student today, just this morning, go over there, and then she got denied services. And I had another student yesterday, who was concerned about her friend who's been depressed, and she was like, "But I know they don't have room. They don't have room for her." And so that breaks my heart, and I don't know what to do because I'm not a counseling professional. So
We'll take
To that extent, though, too, if you have a student that you feel like is suicidal, they will make space based on severity. So
Yes.
when they do an assessment, not every student is treated equally. So if there's a student that you feel like is experiencing suicidal ideation, don't feel like they're full right now, so I won't send them over there. Still send them over to get an assessment
absolutely.
because they do handle cases differently depending on severity.
I want to say one thing about 911 too. There's such a big concern about confidentiality that if you call 911, the fire truck will come. And that is so not confidential. I mean, it seems like, I think that, even if the kid had the gun to her head, I'm not sure I would call 911. It just seems like that's not a good solution to me. I don't ever understand why that's a solution. The other thing you talked about the collaboration, and I understand that Nikki sits on the Student Concerns Committee, but I would also wonder, I've had 2 experiences this semester with international students in the dorm who were taken to the emergency room and the bill was $6,000. And they do not have insurance, and they do not have $6,000. And I was wondering about the collaboration the other way. Is there a way that the RDs can ask Mickey, have they been in the clinic? And they don't know what they need to say because they don't know how expensive medical care is in the U.S. So their scenario was both of them had been treated in the clinic. They didn't know they needed to say that, and so nobody checked on it. So they went to the emergency room. One of them went to the emergency room and got the same prescription she was already taking. So she was there all night, paid $6,000, and for nothing because she had just been to the clinic that day and gotten that same prescription. So it seems like that there's a hole there in the way that the resources are being used for her. And the other girl was her roommate, and when the ambulance came for her, she refused to get in because she knew she couldn't pay for it.
Yeah.
By that point, she knew she couldn't pay for it. So, and she was having an anxiety attack. The arrival of the ambulance did not help.
Yeah. And that, I know what situation you're talking about after that situation happened, because the RDs are trained, like if a student is expressing a certain way or is at a certain level of risk, they call 911. But in this situation, after this incident happened, we talked with Mickey Moore, and we talked with Dr. Devane and Dr. Knight, and they came into one of our meetings, and we're changing that procedure for how that works, especially with international students, where they might not know what the best route is to go or how much it's going to cost. And so that was a big glaring hole that needed to be addressed. As far as calling 911, so the reason we would call 911 is if we need an immediate assistance. So if somebody was considering suicide and we needed an assessment, we can call crisis response team. Sometimes it can take 6 hours, sometimes it can take 8 hours. So 911 is usually our last resort if we know a student is in immediate danger and we're not trained to do that. We call 911 because this, even though it isn't confident, like students know there's an ambulance or a fire truck or something on campus, we care more about making sure that student is safe, or if they're a threat to others, we want to get that right away, if that makes sense.
Well, it does and it doesn't. I mean, I understand that. I understand the urge to call 911 and have this be some professional's problem and get it solved. But who comes when you call 911? I mean, it's a fire truck and an ambulance, and how does that help? If the student's already, well, I remember the student over here who took pills and sliced her wrist and jumped out the window. That's probably a time to call 911. She was lying on the pavement. I just don't understand. I don't really understand how, if a student is feeling suicidal, having an ambulance and fire truck come for them is helpful.
I know I had a situation a few years back with a student. I was on call, responded over at BOB, and was sitting with him for a while. He was nonverbal. He was really in a bad state. Had the area coordinator come out, and we were both kind of working with him and kind of gauging where he was at. And it wasn't an emergency in that, oh my gosh, get him in the ambulance, rush him off, but he did need to be an inpatient at that point. And so we called 911 and basically were just explained, and so there was no fire truck. They didn't come with the lights or the sirens. They just pulled up because we're not allowed to take students. We can't be like, hop in the car. We can't do that for liability reasons. And so that was he couldn't be left alone. And he agreed to it. He agreed to it at that point. But that was a situation I can think of where it wasn't necessarily like immediate at this exact moment, but he needed to be an inpatient, and we needed the paramedics to come and just kind of transport him there. I can also remember a situation where we didn't know if the student had taken pills, and she was just absolutely drunk, as drunk could be. And so that one was really hard because I knew that student, and I knew that she was paying for college herself, and she did not want to get in that ambulance. She did not want to go to the hospital. And I also identified, because I did not have health insurance as a freshman, and I got a concussion as a freshman. The RD called the ambulance. They came out. They assessed me. They're like, you need to go to the hospital. I was like, I'm not getting in that ambulance, and I'm not going to the hospital because I do not have the money for that. And that was my right as a student to refuse that. But in some of these cases, like with that student that was drunk, really just incapacitated, and she had a history, like Ben was saying, of she attempted the last semester. The paramedics even made the call. We didn't even make that call. She had to go. So it's really hard, and that's close to my heart too, because I know that I could not have paid for that if I was a student. And then just pray, Jesus, like, help us, like, fundraise or something. I don't know.
We will be taking donations.
Yeah, and sometimes the reason we would call 911, we might be reasonably assured that if we did call crisis response team, it's still going to end in this manner. So George mentioned that response time of like 6 to 8 hours. So just last weekend, we had an RD that went to conduct an assessment at 5 p.m. one of the rest halls, and the situation ended at 4 in the morning. And so for the student and for the staff, that's a tremendous amount of time to be sitting there with those thoughts and that anxiety. So that's part of it as well, the like cut down on time for cares, so it's drastic.
Yeah, and we aren't allowed to transport them ourselves, and the fears that if they are suicidal, what happens if they jump out of the car, or so yeah, there's just a lot of liability and things that we talk through and try to figure out the best process, but in some ways our hands are tied.
Yeah,
but it's something.
I really appreciate what you guys are doing. I mean, having been resident directors, of course we did transform ourselves. Those were the good old days, right? Just throw them in the car.
Yes.
We do that a lot. It's so changed. Oh
Yeah.
my gosh, you guys. Well, really.
And we do try to make that last resort
Very much.
of 911 is the last resort if we have no other resources we
Sure.
can utilize.
You get
So yeah,
You get to.
Which is so close to the hospital.
I know it's like right down
It's
this.
the worst.
Maybe it's
Yeah,
gonna go
if
for
we
a
just
walk.
walk.
We got a floor back there, nobody's about it.
Get some good exercise on the way.
Looking from a perspective of being involved with many populations of employees in my position, I guess my question would be, how or what areas do you feel that staff in general, not just the faculty population, but the staff can help identify and be a part of this as well? Because there are, I mean, anything from our custodians, they're best friends with our students. I mean, they really are. All the way up to those who are serving in the dining hall. They probably have more open conversations with students than we have on a day-to-day basis. So I guess it's more kind of a broad, we want to help. So I guess how could we support you? It might not be able to be answered in a 2-sentence response, but I guess it's also the offer of letting us know how we can help.
Yeah.
It's been a couple years since we did this, but for a little bit, Josh Zello was hosting ongoing trainings for any staff and faculty that were interested. He did them 4 times throughout the year, where he talked through more in depth what we sort of covered today, like here's your warning signs, and he covered some of the QPR stuff. So this question, persuade, refer, which is like the CPR for mental health, and that was helpful, I think, just because I feel like I've most often seen people that just don't know. You know, like, okay, a student told me they were having thoughts of suicide. I asked if they were okay. They said yes, and so I let them leave. Like, you know, and thinking like, okay, that was a reasonable response. The student said they're okay. And so I think there's always a need for more, training to open up, even what a warning sign is. You know.
And I think, again, just knowing the resources, again, of knowing where you can direct them. And I think the problem we do face in residential life and housing, too, is after 5 p.m., everything shuts down. But we're still going. And that's the main time where students are having these thoughts and they're by themselves. And so, knowing the resources. And we're all having those conversations of, whether it's in the dining hall or custodian. So if you see anything like that, knowing who to connect with and say, you might want to check in on this student I had, something was off or they didn't seem right.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, just being willing to have that conversation, because you're so right. The staff sees, them in all kinds of different settings. So if something seems off, just extending that care and just asking, how are you doing? And really kind of digging in. It's like one of those, like, have you ever seen those what would you do, like, hidden camera things, and they have this thing going on and no one responds? I think it's just reminding, especially staff, like, you're important, you have something to say, and putting that on them, that they can have that conversation, make the difference just as much as any of the rest of anyone can. So, yeah.
And this is a small example. Last year, it wasn't here at Lee, but I passed a student who I had a relationship with, and I could tell he was not, like, he was just having a horrible day. And I walked like 5 steps past him, and I was like, hey, like, how you doing? And from that conversation, it led to that day he just came from the train tracks and was thinking about committing suicide. And so, like, that just alarm of, like, if you see somebody walk by, and nowadays you see students when they're walking by, and it's faculty and staff too, we're on our phones and just, but if you see something's off, like, say something. I think it's so important.
So I have to find there's nobody at the counseling office that's on call at all for you guys to get help?
There's not. There's not. And that's something that, that's a major need we need here at Lee. And at other institutions I've worked at, they've had that, and it's been so helpful to at least to be able to consult. Because even the pressure sometimes that the resident directors feel of, like, this student's life is in my hands right now. And so, that's why I'm so appreciative of the work that they do. And well, thank you all. And if you have additional questions, please feel free to shoot us an email or stop up and talk to us in our offices. We appreciate your time and continuing this conversation. So, thank you.